So I think this is entitled mass indoctrination for a reason, because I don't want to talk about indoctrination. But I'd like to get your opinion on what indoctrination is to begin with. Like we should settle like a nice definition for it.
Well, it's at its basic level, it's repetition, it's mind control, it's peer pressure, it's social conditioning, social engineering. Um, those terms clear enough. It's you manipulate the culture and the media long enough, and you can easily control what people think. Also, education. Um, you infiltrate social groups. You either pay off or attack important social figures. Or you put in place fake social figures. I don't know, like you find the right people who are very charismatic or who are already attracting big
Okay, so that would be the action of. So that would
yeah.
be how mass induction, or that would be how indoctrination is performed. So I think a good counterbalance to that would be what indoctrination is as a state of being, right? So you're indoctrinated, the indoctrinated people, or the mindset of being indoctrinating, or being indoctrinated. Sorry. I think I think it would be best to describe what that is like psychologically speaking. What does that look like? What does that mean for the person? How do they act or behave in ways that are not regular or usual for someone who isn't indoctrinated?
Well, that brings up the topic of cognitive dissonance, which is something that we could do a whole episode about. Well, I talk a lot about the limbic system and how if you believe you're philosophical or not, everyone has a philosophical belief system, a worldview. It's just the difference is either you're conscious of it or you're not, or you're conscious of some of it and you're not conscious of other parts of it. But most people live day to day with a whole worldview in their reality map, their limbic system, their animal brain unconsciously, and that's built through basically information that you accept, that you maybe glean on a subconscious level from things that happen to you in your life, and you build this worldview to create a system that you act upon. Like if you don't know how the world works, then you don't know what to do, right? And we're all forced to do things day to day, at least in the world that we live in. So we have to make decisions, and you can only make decisions if you have a framework to work around, right? So a reality map is what I call it a lot of the time. So if you're indoctrinated, then that means you probably have a lot of assumptions or belief systems that are either not completely valid, completely not real. They just don't actually fit in with the real reality. And I mean, how do you know that? That's a whole in itself.
I think you'd have to slow down there, yeah, because we're talking about consensus reality at this point, right? Okay, so what did you say that we could do an entire episode about?
Well, indoctrination in itself is a great topic.
Yeah, but you said something about indoctrination.
Oh, cognitive dissonance, yeah.
Cognitive dissonance. Okay, so that's a good word that we can sort of like attach to the meaning of indoctrination. It's cognitive dissonance, purely speaking, in a sense. In resumed, we could say that. We could say that to be indoctrinated is to have a cognitive dissonance in your way of thinking. So like you said, you equate that to the map of reality that you create, or at least the understanding of the reality that you create. It has in comparison to the consensus reality of everybody around you, a cognitive dissonance. So the cognitive dissonance would basically be created by the difference of how that reality is mapped next to the consensus reality. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, like, indoctrination typically is seen on mass levels, so it would be
Well, this is wait. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I do want to get into mass indoctrination, but before we get into the difference between indoctrination and mass indoctrination, I'm
just saying that word is typically used in that context. I don't know, like, to indoctrinate a single person. I guess that is something that's possible. It's just I've never really heard of it in that context.
Yeah, well, I
But
mean, like, no, but the indoctrination of groups,
yeah, no, no, for
Heaven's
sure.
Gate, or even self-indoctrination is a thing, and it depends on where we draw the line, right? Like,
Yeah.
is indoctrination? Do you do you call do you draw the line at when someone is educating someone else? Because if you do, then technically every teacher in the world is someone who indoctrinates their students. So where do we draw the line, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, you can redefine words in let's just say you have a cult, for example, right?
Yeah.
And you say if you have a thing that's sticking out, if you have an outie, that's a vagina. If you have an innie, that's a penis. You can like reverse it. So then people think that if they look down and they see what you and I might consider a penis, they think that they're a woman. See what I
Yeah.
mean? And then they go out into society, and then that's not how it works at all.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think generally speaking, though, I think it's safe to say that indoctrination, there's an element of intent in it. Someone has to have the intention of changing the way that whoever they're indoctrinating, change the way that that person sees reality, on a level that is specifically tailored to bring that person some kind of benefit. Okay, so you're capitalizing on that person's change of reality.
You mean the indoctrinator is a benefit, not
Yeah,
the indoctrinatee.
exactly. So if I have the intention of changing your consent, or the way you map your reality, right, in comparison to consensus reality of everybody, then if I do that with the intention of some kind of having some kind of benefit in the in the end run for me, that is technically a strong marker of indoctrination, right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good framework to see it from.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's where we can get into the difference between indoctrination as just like an occurrence that happens between an individual and a group or another individual, and indoctrination that happens on a mass scale. Because I think mass indoctrination, at this point, we can start talking about the fact that it's not necessarily run by an individual, and that mass indoctrination may very well be something that is done by entire groups of people,
Yeah,
to themselves. So it's kind of like, if we use today's example of how the political landscape looks, it seems very strong in terms of probabilities that leftism, radical leftism, it seems to be exclusive to radical leftism, that and mass indoctrination can happen. Because if you think about it
many
this way,
sects in the right, groups in the right definitely self-indoctrinate. Absolutely.
yeah,
Besides,
well,
but yeah.
we'd have to think about that, but I think it's mostly exclusive to I guess exclusive to extremism, then, not necessarily to left or right. But I think,
For sure. For sure.
I think to the left, it's a lot more influential, a lot more. Let's say there's more danger of mass indoctrination when you go towards the left, for specific reasons I'm going to get into in a second. But I think in nature we can add this other term as well to indoctrination, and that it would be tyrannical. So we know that indoctrination has the effect of tyranny on people. It's very oppressive, right?
It's very controlling.
Especially when you're talking about mass indoctrination. So what kind of tyranny, right, is more dangerous? A direct act of tyranny, or a tyranny that is indirect and is self-inflicted, right? Because see, give me an example of what of a scenario of an extreme right-wing sort of like government indoctrinating its citizens. What would that look like?
Well, you could start talking about, for example, race, and make up some facts, some biological facts, talking about the differences between the different races. Not to say that there aren't any, but you can overblow it and control people using those kinds of ideas, or talk about like back in the day, burning gay people or people who are of different races, That is indoctrination, telling them that they're of the devil and that kind of stuff. That's happened before, and I guess in very small groups nowadays it's happening now.
Okay, so it's outright belief oppressing someone else's state of belief. So that would be right wing. That would
Stuff don't actually believe it. Sometimes.
Yeah, but it's direct fascism, right? It's direct tyranny. It's
extremism, as you said.
So this is why I think mass indoctrination is more exclusive to the left, because see, if a right-wing extremist group kind of tells people certain information that is wrong, but they do it with force. So it's not fully, in a sense, it's not indoctrination. It ends up being indoctrination over time, because the new generations that grow up under that system, well, they're indoctrinated just by virtue of everything being that way, of the whole system being calibrated towards that oppressive.
That can be a form of indoctrination in itself.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. But I think it's an indirect. I think the indoctrination process is more of an indirect kind of like byproduct of the fascism, because right-wing extremism, it's more like you have to believe this or else you die. So a lot of people, they're not really even indoctrinated. The intent isn't to indoctrinate. The intent of a fascist, right-wing kind of ideology is to hammer, kind of the will. It's not to like convince people or get people to convince themselves. So I think it's more exclusive to the right. Maybe not completely, but it's exclusive to the right in terms of indoctrination in its pure form, which is to have, the intent. And I think what we're seeing in the left is that it's more dangerous because the intent comes from the people who want to indoctrinate themselves, right? Like it's a self-indoctrination that happens. Because here's how it happens, right? You have this sort of more progressive values on the left, right? And so if you go too extreme, then you get so progressive that you become tyrannical. So like progress typically supports liberal values, right? Freedom and stuff. But in order to preserve freedom, if you go too extreme, then you inadvertently start oppressing the freedom you're trying to protect or even spread, right? So that's why people are like, well, we don't want racism. We want freedom of not feeling, I don't know, racism, right? We want freedom from. This is the thing. Like they're so liberal and progressive to the point where they want to liberate themselves from being offended, from being, from discomfort in a sense. So that's too extreme. And in order to protect those values, they need to be tyrannical in a sense. And in order to be tyrannical, which goes against their very sort of like system of value, they need to indoctrinate. They rely on the indoctrination process. If people believe it themselves and indoctrinate themselves, that it's not tyrannical to oppress free speech so as to safeguard these values that we have, which is to not offend people and to not, be racist and all this kind of stuff, then again, it's a very dangerous form of indoctrination, of mass indoctrination. I think it really relies on it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could say it's almost it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense, self-fulfilling action, because these things are rooted. If you're talking about the left versus the right, I mean, you said in another podcast, what's that quote? You start young.
Typically, if you have any heart when you're young, you'll be liberal, and if you have any brain when you get older, you'll become conservative.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, I mean, just the fact in itself that leftist ideals are very alluring. Freedom, equality, everyone gets a chance, everyone gets opportunity, and all that kind of stuff. That in itself is it allows more ease for self-indoctrination, because it's like a slippery slope. It's a weird thing.
It's a weird thing. You're right. It's kind of weird how the very opposite of tyranny and oppression is actually something that is a slope towards it. You know, so like if you safeguard freedom so much, it's a slippery slope towards you know, oppression, towards
Like these vegans who send me death threats for eating an animal. It's like, it's kind of self-contradictory.
yeah, you're gonna kill an animal that we hold in higher value than the other animals
Apparently
that you're
not.
trying to protect. But yeah, then it becomes even more extreme, where it's like, well, you devalue, you know, a certain animal over another. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, we're all animals, right? But yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So you know, I want to take it to the education sort of topic, because there's a lady, I have to get her name. I'll probably put it in the link in the description. It's a podcast that that Rubin had from the Rubin Report with a professor from Canada, and this woman, she was talking about how this sort of mass indoctrination propagates in the political sphere and then infects everything else in society. And it's actually quite simply ingenious. And in a sense, isn't really anybody's kind of like fault. I think, you know, it's like a counterbalance. It's like a pendulum, right? I mean, so if everything swings one way, it's bound to swing the other way. I mean, it can't, do you know what I mean? It's eventually going to reach the opposite effect. And so after World War II, you know, there's a sort of like swing towards the opposite of fascism, right? And then you got communism. So that's almost like the pendulum making a 360-degree turn, right? But after that 360-degree turn, we're sort of going back into the sort of leftism. So, you know, you had the fascism of the World War II, and we came out of that. So the overwhelming response was to go way towards the freedom, but so much so that we had to create an Orwellian world. So you have this sort of communist regimes. These communist regimes ended up killing even more people than in World War II. So we sort of stabilized since then. But since then, just because of the nature of power dynamics and hierarchical structures and how that functions in the universe, you know, power always exists, and and hierarchies are always at risk of being tyrannical. And tyranny is something that is more that is achieved directly when it comes by right-wing values. And so it seems, you know, more, I guess, direct. It seems more it seems more sensical to attack right-wing values, right? Because that seems to be the yeah, I mean, it seems to be what is at greater risk for tyranny. And so this is why I think the left is, once again, even though in the 20th century we've seen where it can go and how far it can go, I think this is why we're slipping back into the leftism, because World War II had such an impact on populations that have a lot more influence. Okay, so I know this is going to sound anti-Semitic. People are going to say, you know, oh, you're speaking up against the Jews again, you know. But you know, well, I mean, you're Jewish, and I don't have any problem saying this. So I think because Jewish influence, you know, it's true, and we should say, well, look, you know, these people have gone through a lot, and so we need to preserve a sort of like, we don't ever want a Holocaust ever again, you know. Let's just say we don't ever want a genocide of any peoples, but especially not the Jewish people, right? Because come on, like, they've had it tough. We have priorities. It's not me. I'm not trying to say that it's you know, better to value one people over another. We should value them all, but we should at least, you know, have more preventative action towards the people who have suffered the most, right? And so I think that right there is a big sentiment that has fueled a more liberal agenda in the world, right? We can see that we don't want right-wing fascist sort of like structures, because it's caused damage, and irreparable damage, and I think probably even bigger, what's the term I want to use? It probably even more evil acts Okay, I don't like to think of it in terms of death toll. Yes, communism has a greater death toll even after World War II, but you know what happened to the Jews? It goes beyond just death toll. I mean, the kind of torture
Yeah.
and sort of like repercussions that it had on the world, in some ways, is worse than just the high death toll of, let's say, the people in Asia. Not to say that it's any better, but you know what I mean. All I'm saying is that these kinds of influences is the reason for why I believe that we're slipping into this sort of leftism again. And it tends to go towards leftism because obviously people want to be free, but it's a very, very slippery kind of like hook that people don't see. And it's like, yeah, guys, we want freedom, but we don't necessarily reach it the way that you think it's
Yeah.
possible
Well,
to be attained.
you want to create a police state to make sure that everyone gets freedom. It's like, how do you regulate that freedom? How do you make sure everyone's free all the time? Well, then you have to get people who are hired to do that. But how do you end up trusting them?
Yeah, how do you, and also you need to define freedom, you know, and you have
There
to,
you go.
it's like, well, okay, so this police state has to define freedom, you know, democratically speaking, but how is that gonna, how can you do that? And the only way to do it is to have a flexible kind of system, and that flexible system is freedom of speech. But I never actually got into the education thing. So this professor, I think she's from Saskatchewan anyway, she was explaining how this functions. So obviously I've just explained whose fault it is, and it's not a fault of someone, it's a fault of events and how the events have sort of impacted the future, right? So you had World War II, that fascism has had an impact throughout the 20th century, which was, you know, leftist radicalism. And then after the radicalism, it sort of stabilized itself a little bit. We've had a increasingly a better world when it comes to, you know, stability between communism and democracy. But through the system of communism, you started seeing a democratic kind of like revolution, right? You see like how China has been a lot more liberal with their economy, and yet in the democratic world in the States, it's become a lot more fascist. It's kind of a weird thing. So it's not about the political structure. It's about the de facto sort of political manifestations, right? And so this is why we're going back into the left. And then what happens when you go into that sort of slipping into that leftism kind of liberal values? Well, you're getting people who are going to teach, right, those values. So in the education system, when you're talking about, you know, high schools and colleges and universities, well, the things that the teachers are teaching, what? They're teaching history, right? They're teaching that this is what happened in the political landscape in the last 100, 200 years, what's really relevant to us today. So it's only natural that everything's going to incline even more on the left. And then it's only a matter of time between those high school students going to college, doing their 4-year term, and then getting out onto the job market as other teachers or as lawyers or as, you know, citizens of society in all different fields, and they have these ideologies that their teachers have been teaching them for a while, right? Which is a sort of radical kind of worldview of you know, Antifa, which is literally to use fascism against fascism, fighting fire with fire, and there you go, right?
Yeah, universities are basically Antifa school.
That's the indoctrination sort of mainframe. It seems to spread everywhere. It starts with education, and then it ends up being everything. This is why you can't work at Google without having anything, you know, even near center, or at least what the center used to be in terms of values, right? I mean, like James Damore, right? He was only, you know, bringing into question or into light these biological facts in terms of, you know, how there is a difference between men and women, not even that, you know, we should do anything different. And he got sort of fired for it, right? And this is Google, a tech company here. We're not even talking about schools.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the engine of indoctrination spreads to every institution.
Yeah, no, I mean, with a lot of the legal stuff that Facebook and Google's been going through lately, it's just funny because they put out their opinions saying something like, well, we have the power to influence votes and minds, so we better take advantage of that. It's like, no, your opinion doesn't matter. Like, that's not your job. That's not the point of what you're doing. What you're doing right now is just, you're trying to give out objective information. You're trying to create the best system for anyone. Anyways, I don't want to get too bogged down in the left versus right stuff, because to me, a lot of that is diversion tactics from the real issues. But on the surface, yeah, I guess it does make a lot of sense with like the mainstream stuff, the very PC, politically correct stuff, and the academic culture. I mean, it only makes sense. We know this at this point, that humans prefer to follow social trends versus reality. It's just safer. It's always been safer way to live, because we're surrounded by people, and that's our support structure.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. So wait a second. You're right. So it seems like just by virtue of societies becoming more complex and more interconnected, leftism, or at least liberal values, trump conservative values, just by virtue of us becoming a more complex society. That makes a lot of sense. Because like you said, we're surrounded by
physical reality, we're more connected to the internet. So
yeah, we're more connected to people.
Pick up any kind of social reality we want on the internet, but it doesn't necessarily apply to actual physics and nature and biology.
You're right. You're right. Because like, see, like the likelihood of your business succeeding really relies on how you've appealed to the people, not on how you've toiled the soil or
exactly.
You know what I mean? So that's interesting, man. So indoctrination has that kind of very powerful motivational force behind it, which is that you need to buy into this indoctrination.
Yeah. If you want to get laid and be socially acceptable and get social brownie points, then you have to be professing what appeals to the most people, right? It's easy. It's like, I mean, if I really wanted to become a public figure, it wouldn't be that hard, man. I could start wearing a dress, and I'd have a few buzz phrases, and I'm famous.
Sound bites that you could just repeat over and over again, like a tool. Why don't you do it? Actually, no, there's a magician. His name is James. James Randi. He was famous for doing it in the 80s. He's been doing it for like 40 years. His job is literally that. He started out as a magician, and then he's still a magician, but he sort of made it his career to debunk mystics and people who were, you know what I mean, proclaiming kind of divine powers and all that kind of stuff. And so
I have some qualms with the Amazing Randy, but I like a lot of what he's doing.
That's right, the Amazing Randy. But what I like what he did is he met, I think it was a student at the time. Anyway, the guy's his husband now, but together they partnered up, and he made it. What he did was he got this student of his to become, in a sense, to a guru. All right, and they use every trick in the book that he's seen up to that point. And this guy became very popular at some point, and was doing magic tricks and that kind of stuff, and being very esoteric, and people were buying into it, right? And then at some point, I think it was on Jimmy Carter's show. Is it Jimmy Carter? So I'm too young, really, but I think it was Jimmy Carter, the Late Show, before David Letterman. Anyway, I don't even know if that was the same show, but anyway, the point is, on some talk show, he, at some point when it got big enough, he came on with this guru, and he said, "Guys, this has all been a sham," right?
Yeah, but okay, like that's very small scale. But do you really think that people have not been investing ridiculous amounts of money and energy into studying how to do this stuff perfectly? Yeah. And manipulate people really fucking well? What do you think? Why do you think the advertising business has so much research funding?
Yeah, see, that's indoctrination right there. Yeah, the media. But it was all just to say that this guy, I think he had told people, and he had proved it to them. He said, look, I got this guy to become one of these guru kind of like quacks that you guys are sinking your money into, and we're proving it to you that this is all fake. And yet you still have people bending spoons and selling kind of gems and rocks that fix some kind of like arthritis type stuff. So it seems to me like does that have any value to break the indoctrination, to actually do the same thing that the Amazing Randy did? I mean, it seems like the Amazing Randy back then,
like reverse engineer.
Yeah, well, like you said, wear a dress and then go out with a few sound bites, and then at the end of it say, look guys, this has all been like a mockery. Yeah. I think it's almost like you either have to be very surreptitious yourself to pull the veil over their eyes, or you have to like rip it off. There's no like in between when it comes to self-indoctrination. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Especially on a mass scale, right?
That's the thing. In my opinion, indoctrination goes so much deeper than just leftist ideals. But I mean, that would be a start. It could be a lot of fun too.
The problem, we should maybe look into something like that. But the problem with self mass indoctrination, I'm going to say, right? It's mass indoctrination that's on a grand scale, and that population is doing it to themselves at some point. I think the problem with that is that it attacks free speech. And once you've attacked free speech, that's when you've really made it difficult, if not impossible, to be sort of like, I guess, unfrozen from your indoctrination.
We have to do an episode on free speech.
If you've made it impossible for even yourself to say anything, freely.
Yeah. If you're scared day to day, like at your job or something, or in a bar, to say certain things.
Yeah. And then much less, that just pushes your own indoctrination even further. So if you don't think certain things on a daily basis, and you get used to not thinking those things because you can't even say them, then you've fallen even more into this like robotic kind of like, sort of being that just thinks and feels the way that you've conditioned yourself to feel and think. And so
I'm sure you've seen the NPC meme.
Yeah. No, I haven't seen it. What is it?
No? Okay, it's pretty popular nowadays. The left hates it. It's just I'm sure you've seen it. Fuck man, it's hilarious, but it is a little offensive. It's just about people becoming numbers, becoming drones, and it's just left.
Sorry, cut off there. Can you repeat that?
Well, what I was saying is the NPC meme is just referencing the fact that the left basically relies off of buzz phrases, just like these ideas that they keep repeating over and over again. And you can keep throwing arguments at them, but then they'll be like,
yeah. But here's the thing.
One says no, blah, 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 has their buzz phrase, throws it out.
Yeah, exactly. So, but these buzz phrases that come out, it's not even a buzz phrase that just comes out regardless of what you say anymore. It's that they don't even want to hear what you say. They will cut you off right away. Ruben, it happened to him. He was speaking at some college, and you see an audience that came to see him, right? And then Bill Maher had a scenario that happened like that, and he said, audience comes from the Latin to listen. so literally, they come as an audience, and yet they're not there to listen. They're there to obstruct him from speaking, right? So not only is it a case of I'm indoctrinated, I don't even want to hear what you have to say. It's I'm indoctrinated. Not only do I not want to hear what people have to say when it's said to me, things I don't want to hear, when it's said to me, in the natural order of things, but I want to go to where people are saying that. I want to go out of my way to go and stop them from saying it, right?
Yeah, if they represent something that doesn't work in line with their NPC or indoctrinated social group's values, then they'll go out of their way and just berate them without ever listening.
Yeah, because it's one, it helps with their virtue signaling, which again is social brownie points that helps towards their own sort of thriving economy of of whatever you gain from virtue signaling. And two, I think they do it because it's become a religion, right? The religiosity of people takes root in this ideology of having to make sure that the world is rid of offensive people. And so when you combine religiosity with, which is already in its own way, and indoctrination of its own kind, right? Like religion indoctrinates to some degree, right? And so
as soon as you have a group of people who hold a value high enough, anything, that it becomes religious.
Yeah, exactly. And but for some reason we don't make the distinction between religion and indoctrination, right? We see religion as being, you know, like separate from a system of indoctrination, but it's exactly that. Because see, a religion which is supposed to treat the spirit, at least, or whatever their beliefs are, or treat people with the kind of respect that they usually preach, and all these values that they're trying to hold up. Well, they need to indoctrinate those people with those values. It's not about saying, okay, look, you know, we have been practicing these sort of methods to, you know, be in touch with God and spirituality, and here's what we found out. Test it for yourself and see for yourself, and then, you know, kind of, you know, we are there for you, you know, and here's how you can come and commune. No, it's not like that. It's, look, this is how the world works, and we need to, at every stage of your life, at age 6 you get your confirmation, or whatever, you know. I think at age 6 there's a kind of it's your first confession, I think. And then at age 8, it's your first communion, and then it's age 12, your confirmation. Like, you know, it's a systematic indoctrination, right? This is with Catholicism anyway. But in most religions, it's a system of indoctrination, because it's not like, look, this is what we found out about the world and about God. You know, you're free to share in it, and you know, turn away if you're not convinced, or if you feel that there's a practice out there that's more suitable to your worldview. No, it's not like that, right? So indoctrination comes in many forms, man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Of course, but I think a big issue nowadays, and you see it on every side of the scale, it's people freaking out because they're scared that their world's going to fall apart. So let's just take the left, and they want to stamp out hate speech, right? Which is like what they consider an extension of free speech, because they feel that if people are free to express what they consider hate speech, then that will incite people to violence. But we have to draw a line between action and words, first of all. But I understand at the same time, because it's like, you know, people who are desperate to do something about the environment, right? They get aggressive with people who feel like there's no issues with the environment, which honestly there are very few. Maybe climate change deniers, that's another thing, but it's a desperate race at this point for our future, and everyone's freaking out because they have a different idea of what the right thing to do for the best future is. Yeah. And that gets very, very dangerous. As soon as we start panicking and we get really worried about where things are going, and we assume that the best course of action for everyone is this or that.
That's interesting. That's another delicate kind of perspective, you know, that we're looking at here. What you're saying is essentially is that just
to say it, like a tool used in cults all the time is fear. Like, you know, the end of the world is coming, so we have to do this.
Yeah, but I think there's an external force at work here, and you just explained it. I think the fear itself, you know, it's not just propagated by people who have these beliefs. It's actually coming from a source that's very real. We are seeing these sort of changes in the climate, and we are seeing these changes in society based on our technology and where things are headed with politics and culture and all these things. So the fear that's generated out of those things is itself kind of like fuel to the indoctrination. People have to choose a side and and they want to indoctrinate themselves in that sense, that it's very comforting. If they can hold on to a belief so strongly that it brings them comfort, they're willing to indoctrinate themselves as well, if that's the end goal, right? It's like, well, yeah, sure, I'll indoctrinate myself if it helps me sleep at night, you know. And I think I would as well. If it's like, okay, cool, I'm worried about the environment the most because I'm afraid that, you know, there's going to be tsunamis in the future and my kids won't be able to see whales and these kind of beautiful animals and whatever it is, right? And we won't be able
you
to
won't have peace in your old age.
but, you know, if you're worried about all these things, then you're going to indoctrinate yourself into believing that these things are very real, and so you're going to want to fight for them, and you're going to end up fighting for them with aggression if you have to, because you know, and you've convinced yourself, you've indoctrinated yourself to the degree where you've convinced yourself that it's absolutely important, and that it's valid, that whatever means necessary is valid.
Mm-hmm. Well,
to achieve your goals.
Yeah, no, but that's the question: who's right?
Yeah.
And that's not an easy question to ask, and unfortunately, it's the question that most people are going to have to ask themselves and start figuring out for themselves if we actually want to get anywhere and understand each other and be able to agree on anything.
So you need one, skepticism, and two, free speech.
Yeah.
Those are the two things. The solutions really, I think, end up being those things. We need to support skepticism and free speech. But here's the thing.
But then there's still people who think that those things lead to bad things.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like you're not just fighting one battle here. You're fighting battles on all fronts, because you have to attack, you know, morality. You have to attack, because ultimately speaking, none of these things matter if you haven't figured out the fundamentals, right? That's why it always goes back down to spirituality and existentialism and you know, religion and science and that sort of old debate. It always goes back down to that at some point, right? But so you're fighting on that front. You're fighting on the fear front of the current events, and then you're fighting on the political front and this sort of indoctrination, I guess, byproducts, which would be, you know, the infected sort of journalism. And by that, I mean that most journalism is biased nowadays. So that's an infection. You know, you're talking about the infected education system. You know, there's an indoctrination at the very root of the curriculums. So, and then those curriculums are supported by politics that, you know, it's kind of like, well, I'm pretty sure there's the Minister of Education, which is a political thing, is the one who ultimately decides what the curriculums teach. You know, so then it becomes, so it's all sort of interconnected. So you have all these battles on all these fronts, because you can't just say, okay, we're going to attack the political side of it. But the political side is affected by the religious side, you know, and the religious side is affected. It's all interconnected. Yeah.
When people say politics, it's very vague, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, everything, right? Economics, politics, science, religion. Yeah. You know, this is a fight on all fronts here.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to attack. And I think that's part of the problem too, is like, how do you attack this mass indoctrination, you know, from one angle? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And how much does it allow you to do? What like, because morals play a part in this. Say we have a very science-driven society nowadays. Even a lot of religious people are moving more towards science-based belief systems. But what if your science tells you that it's okay to kill off half the population?
Yeah, see, it becomes a morality issue. But here's the thing. Yeah. Even science can be, you know.
But then you can't wait, because if these people's main value is science, and you can't yet prove any form of morality with the science, which is their number one form of way of seeing things, then they can do whatever they want practically.
Yeah, but also I think, like, you know, regardless of science or religion and all these sort of like complicated domains, I think ultimately speaking, to be uncertain is something we need to spread like sentiment across the globe. So this is why I like Stephen Fry, right? And Stephen Fry's kind of like, you know, role model was Bertrand Russell. At least he really, you know, admired Bertrand Russell, and he said that, right? That Bertrand Russell kind of was one of the strongest philosophers in that sense, in the sense
I
that he
personally
really,
despise Bertrand Russell. I'm just going to throw that in there. I always have to say it when someone mentions him.
yeah,
I'm sorry.
but he really does advocate for uncertainty and skepticism, and it's important because ultimately speaking, these battles aren't going to be fought by like, okay, so the intellectual dark web is going to be fighting the political front, you know, the Harvard is going to be fighting the education front or whatever. It's not going to work that way. How it's going to work is if you get more and more sort of people from all around the world in every domain, in every kind of like random way, if you get those people to speak out, to value free speech, then I think a skepticism will grow from that. If people really kind of speak the ideas, then those ideas are infectious. They get other people who may not want to listen but heard you anyway, or heard someone anyway. It got them to question. It got them to, you know what I mean? Because that person said something that attained that person. And so that kind of spreads, and it starts a sort of skepticism. And then in that skepticism, you're going to get people who really see that, okay, wow, you know, like there's been a bit of free speech happening, a lot of ideas floating around. I'm really not certain, you know, I'm skeptical now. And so people are going to be skeptical whether they want to or not. And then they're going to claim that they're skeptical because free speech has gotten to that point. And then skepticism is going to be seen as, oh, this is a good thing because now we can really sort of like attack all of our issues without fear, right? And without certainty, because we know that if we do go back to certainty and we do go back to you know, restricted speech, then we're not going to be able to figure these things out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree, but skepticism is not so clear cut. It's a rabbit hole, and you'll find people disagreeing. You'll find skeptics who disagree all the time, and that's the main point of it.
Yeah, it gets too impractical at some point. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we don't really know. That's a big question. Some people have to, you know, just survive. You can't spend all your time trying to figure out the truth.
No, you have to choose a truth, or at least choose a practical sort of route and stick with it, you know, and if it yields results, it yields results. You can't just stay, you know, at the fork of the road. I know. And that's what I'm saying. You don't want to take skepticism too far, but it's clear that right now that's what is needed. You know, that's what the doctor ordered.
Yeah, no, I agree. But that again, what I'm saying is one skeptic is going to start doubting reality itself and become solipsist. One will start doubting the family values that they've been grown up with, that tell them like men should have a family role, like a male role, head of the family kind of thing, and women.
Yeah, but I mean, like even radical skepticism doesn't breed, you know, hatred and oppression. I mean, like if everybody's radically skeptical, then nobody's really fighting about anything. They're just all saying, well, we don't know. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I agree. All I'm saying is that just to sell skepticism in the under the pretense that if we're all skeptical, it's going to be okay. It's true in some ways. It's a good step in the right direction, but I don't think it's what people might expect, because it's a never-ending process.
Yeah, skepticism in itself is not a solution, but it's a sort of like
step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, can we resume this sort of mass indoctrination in terms of what's happening in society today?
I think we're coming from two different places, you and I, when it comes to what we consider to be mass indoctrination. There's many levels to it. There's what is done to oneself, what is, you know, as you were saying, mass auto indoctrination, the like kind of echo chamber kind of vibe. I mean, if you see a video that Facebook sponsors about something political, and then you're like, oh, this makes sense, and you start researching it on Google, and you just end up finding nothing but articles that confirm what you're looking into, and then you talk to people at your university and everyone has the same opinions because all the professors are agreeing on something, then that is a form of indoctrination if it's not actually correct. And I mean, you could imagine that suddenly we're all coming really, really close to the truth. You know what I mean? Like all the academics, we know the ultimate truth now, and that's why they all agree. Or you can step in and be like, maybe they're right, or I'll test these opinions, you see? Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent, but all to say there's the echo chamber effect of what you can do to yourself. But I also fully believe in conscious social engineering from certain groups, people who have put an enormous amount of time and money into controlling opinions and views. And I mean, there's everything in between too, right? There's like say there's a scientific there's a university and it's being sponsored by its nutrition division is being sponsored by Coca-Cola and the grain industry, which is the case in most cases. Well, even if they're trying to achieve non-biased studies, there's kind of a conflict of interest, right? If your entire funding comes from a certain group and your findings find that what they sell is killing the population, say, you might twist some details, and it happens a lot. We've seen this again and again. It's been proven. A lot of studies have been retracted. So all to say, there's everything from us lying to ourselves to people in very high places of power lying to everybody. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's like a double whammy. You got like, not only do you have maybe a sort of kind of, I guess what you're saying is like evil genius behind the scenes, like a puppet master sort of scenario.
I understand that's not, a lot of people don't believe in that, but I hate to say
no,
there's
but the way you
put them out there.
Not at all. I think what you've just described is purely logical. I mean, we're seeing it's not even conspiracy anymore. We've seen these case scenarios in the States happen time and time again. That's just the way it works, right?
Yeah.
It's not even a secret for a lot of these things. So it just kind of makes you wonder, well, what is the secret behind that, right? It's like, shit, if that kind of conflict of interest isn't even a secret anymore, what could there be possibly? But if we're sticking to empirical facts for this one, I think we can merge our ideas of what indoctrination is. I think it's partly that, and it's partly that people are self-indoctrinating for many other reasons as well, and that's what's leading the sort of polarization of today, right?
Yeah. Again, it's what makes things easier. Who has the strongest social pull in society, be it through their money, their influence, their attractiveness, their charisma, and are they being manipulated? Is it? Would you rather find truth and get rejected by someone who has all of the brownie points, or get the brownie points? And you might not even be aware of that dichotomy when you're trying to find the truth. You have to be hyper aware of it if you're actually going to work in a conscious way. But most people aren't. Most people, it's instinctual. It's not, I don't blame anyone for acting that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But can you explain that dichotomy a little bit more clearly?
Yeah, I mean, let me think. I'm trying to find a good example. Like, I'm not a climate denier. I believe in environmental issues, maybe in a different way than a lot of people do. But it is like, someone sent me an article during a debate about this. I personally believe that meat production, if done right, is really good for the environment and should be done on a large scale properly. But there's a lot of, within the climatologist communities, there's a little group who believe that we should abolish or like reduce meat production enormously. I'll call them the vegan climatologists. And they get hated on by most climatologists, because most climatologists know that they don't know that much about ecology and soil sequestration and all those kinds of things. That's not their field. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But when you talk to them, the average, because I've been contacting some, and just to see what's going on there in people's opinions. Well, I talked to one and he said, oh yeah, I kind of assumed that meat production was just bad for the environment, but it's because I've been hanging out, like my peers all think that, but it's only because like a few of us read an article off of, what was it? I think The Guardian about this. And The Guardian actually published another article completely contradicting that later on, just to say. But then when I talked to this guy, he said, well, he reviewed the information I sent him, and he's like, oh yeah, well, this actually makes a lot more sense. I guess it's just that me and my buddies, it's the social group. Like, these scientists are not above these social issues. Like, they are studying some things that are closer to fact, but the specific issue of meat in relation to what they're studying, when someone asks them about it and they say, oh yeah, meat is bad for the environment, you don't know if it's what they're actually studying, or if it's just something that's sort of linked to what they're studying, but they haven't really looked into, and is just part of their peer group. You see what I mean?
Okay, so yeah, that kind of influences the whole scientific consensus thing. It's like, okay, well, there's overwhelming consensus among the scientific community on this issue, but then you have that sort of like you said, that dichotomy kind of like infection. It's like, okay, well, maybe these scientists are sort of like influencing each other for the social brownie points, which would be
don't know what details exactly are really, really based in fact, and what are more just assumed and part of the social groups or the assumptions. It's
kind of like, and it's important to make the distinction, because it's kind of like, okay, it's one thing to say that there is climate change, right? And that agriculture does have a big impact on it. But it's another thing to say that, you know, that the solution for the agricultural components that has an effect on the climate should be to reduce all meat consumption or even eliminate it, because that's a big distinction. Because it's kind of like you said, what if the solution is actually to change how meat production is actually, you know what I mean? Because then if you were to have eliminated it just based on the grounds that everybody thought that's what we had to do because of this sort of social brownie point system of indoctrination took hold, then you've actually made it worse for the environment, right? Because you could have used this sort of channel to actually make things better. Because it's like, and you're not the first one. I've seen a documentary. My aunt passed through on it recently. It's a CBC documentary, I think. Anyway, but no, it's not CBC. Anyway, it's a documentary about agriculture, and yeah, like the most famous farmer in the States, he's been teaching, you know, agriculture for the last 20, 30 years apparently, and he explained it very, very simply and very well. You know, like livestock, you know, has a big impact and a big sort of like role to play when it comes to the ecosystem. So yes, we don't want to have like these factory farms, you know, where you have like, you know, just like a bunch of land that is completely turned into dirt fields, where you can sort of fill these troughs with like grain, so that these sort of like, you know, livestock can live by the thousands and die by the thousands. Of course, that's not good. But that if we were to get rid of that entirely and then just grow, you know, like vegetables in glass houses in those places,
all life out of the soil. And you need the prairie lands, you need the grass-fed animals to actually fertilize the soil and be able to keep growing plants. Did you know that I think it's what's that country where there was a lot of war in the Middle East? Afghanistan, I think, and a few of the neighboring countries.
There's tons.
Sorry. They Madagascar, they used to be mostly like verdant, like beautiful gardens kind of thing, and now they're all desertified because of the 12,000 years of agriculture that we've been doing, and without proper crop rotations or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think it's very clear how indoctrination can have a big impact on how we view things, therefore how we do things as well.
Yep.
Social brownie points, man. It's virtue signaling. It gets even into the most important of domains. The domains are supposed to be the most objective. Journalism is infected. Science, of course, has to be infected, especially if the science that's the scientific sort of like community that's coming out onto the job market are these ideologues, right? Who are sort of brainwashed.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course we can't discount the idea that there might be conscious manipulation through money and power schemes and like death threats and all that. But
naturally, of course. Yeah.
It all becomes one ultimately. Yeah, no, that's a huge part of it. It's quite scary, really, because we have this idea of, for example, science and information nowadays being so perfect. And I completely agree with the scientific method. I think it's perfect in isolation, but then you give it to humans and it becomes a completely different thing. It's to make a god out of rationality. Yeah, I mean, you could see rationality as like something that is perfect in itself, but then you give it to humans and you have to start questioning things. You have to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best sort of like shot that we have at sort of at least at having positive impact on what we do in life. But I think ultimately speaking, ironically, speech is what we need to focus on. That's the only way that we're going to be able to regain the objectivity that's been lost when it comes to these domains that are supposed to be objective, like science and journalism and education. You know what I mean? Like Lindsay Shepherd thing. I don't know if you saw, but that was a big ordeal in Canada. Again, like she was a teaching assistant at Wilfrid Laurier University. I think that's in London, Ontario, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, she was simply showing a video of Jordan Peterson talking, I think, at the University of Toronto when he had that big sort of thing blow up in his face. He was talking about not, kind of collapsing under the weight of the legislation that would compel speech for trans rights and that kind of thing. Anyway, she just showed that side of the argument to her students to say, look, this is what's happening in the political sphere right now in counterbalance to the trans sort of rights activism that you're seeing. So and she got reprimanded for it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So this kind of objectivity that's been lost in education, I think, is primary, and because when you're talking about education, you're talking about political activity. Now, it's important to separate, and make the distinction very clearly. Political activity is something that is very necessary in universities. Why? Because universities are places of thought. They're places of ingenuity. We're harnessing the power of the youth and the intellect of the old, okay, combined. And what I mean by that is you have the administration, the faculty, right, the teachers who provide the structure wherein these young people can be politically active and throw their ideas around, new and fresh things. And so what's happened is really the sort of switching of roles. You have the administration, you have the teachers who are politically active and have a political sort of bias and are infecting the students. They're robbing the students of their own sort of critical thought. And so we need to restore that perfect objectivity within the administration and the staff of universities and places of education, so that the students can ultimately feel, and not just feel, but be compelled to think critically and speak freely. And then that political activity sort of breeds, and then it spreads to the rest of the world, right? It spreads to the other domains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. It's hard to say where to start, right?
well, I think that's where you have to start. But it's like, how do
I
you do
agree.
that? How do you do that? That's the question. How do you sort of, you can't just fire, let's say 50% of the liberal staff at,
That
Harvard
would be ridiculous.
or U of T, and then just hire, conservative professors to balance it out. It doesn't work that way. Justin Trudeau did it that way with his cabinet, which is fucking insane, right? But
Yeah.
So how do we do it?
Well, first of all, we're doing what we do now. We're talking. Hopefully, someone will listen and they'll do some research. Maybe they'll talk to people that have more power. It's just kind of spreading this stuff as well as we can. Unfortunately, we have a small reach right now, but that doesn't mean it won't grow. And we got to keep putting better content out. It's right now. We can't really tell anyone else what to do except try your best to find the truth and never stop. That's it. That is all. But for what we can do right now is just keep doing this.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's kind of like the polarization kind of negates itself, because the more you have, two parties becoming polarized, the more you're going to accumulate a mass in the center as well. And that's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing so many people going further right and further left, that there's a bunch of people that will, the more that polarization sort of stretches, the more that those sort of counterweights have less mass at some point, because people start leaving. It's kind of like, okay, I'll follow along to the left up to a certain point, which I did, right? I'm still, left of center, at least classically speaking. But, when all this sort of crazy, anti-free speech stuff started happening, it's like, whoa, this is where I stop. This is where I get off the boat, right? So all these people who are finding themselves, I think, a lot more lonely, because there isn't like a group for 3/4 off from the center towards the left. You know what I mean? It's kind of like you're either following on the boats that's really down the road now and you don't want to be part of, or you know what I mean, you're in the center. You're going towards the center to talk to the people who on the other side and say, well, what the fuck's going on, right? And so I think that really is what's happening. The intellectual dark web is a great example, and we need to support it in every way we can.
Mm-hmm.
And this podcast is a good start. I think we should go with your idea, though. I wonder if wearing a dress and then taking photos and like starting an Instagram account and like fighting for the cause that's like, we should fight for, like, we should create a cause that would really impact. You know what I mean? That would
pride.
Yeah.
You have to find a new way to make people offended. Like give a new perspective for people to feel like they can get triggered, and because that's actually like an avenue for people. It's like, how would I say this?
What if we make it contradictory? What if we try to throw a sort of contradiction in their spokes? Like,
well, dude,
for example,
the whole worldview in itself is completely contradictory. It's self-contradictory in itself, but we could play on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like, okay, well, I'm a white man, right? So I have less social value by using the system that these guys have set up with identity
As soon as
politics.
you say you're gay or you're trans or you're a cross-dresser, it's fine.
My social sort of status has gone up, yes. So, but what if it becomes contradictory? What if I'm a extremely right-wing sort of like politically, like, that's my ideology. I'm a conservative, gay, trans, kind of like identify as, queer or whatever, right? Like, how would that contradiction sort of like, send shockwaves? How would they react in that
It
sort of?
comes down to who you criticize.
How so?
Well, because for example, there's Milo Yiannopoulos, right? He's
It's exactly what I just
gay, but he's extremely right wing, and he criticizes most of the left wing idealism, right? I'm not saying I like Milo or anything, but
Oh yeah, no, but here's the thing. He does it straight up, right? Like he says, "Look, I am what you guys fight for, but I don't believe what you fight for, right? But I don't want to do it quite that way. I would do it more like I I wouldn't want them. I want them to get confused. I want them to be in a new realm where they have to either push their crazy identity politics further so that they can include me, or say, okay, you know, it doesn't make sense, and just sort of it would create a sort of confusion, a chasm.
well, I let's just say I could say um, I'm a trans woman, but I'm into women, so I'm technically a lesbian. But I like lesbian relationships because they technically have, well, statistically have 30% more abuse and violence. But you know why that's good for lesbians? Because it takes away from the stereotype that women can't be violent and manly.
Yeah, that's
You can go deeper and deeper. I'm not saying any of that's true, but it's just like you can switch the shit around infinitely.
yeah. I don't know. It would have to be, I don't know, more brilliant and more simple.
No, I know, but that's off the fucking top of my head, man.
I know. That was pretty good.
Million things.
Yeah, that was pretty good for off the top of your head. Shit, that's a tough one. We're gonna have to brainstorm, but you know, I think that would help at least confuse some of the people on that in that indoctrination stage and be like, huh, I wonder what's happening here. Maybe I should rethink a couple things.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you can.
I don't know. I mean, what if I was a humorist? Like, what if I was like a super leftist comedian, and the comedy that I sort of
comedy is dead.
Yeah, I know, but that's what would make it interesting. I think if I'm a leftist comedian that sort of makes jokes, you see, like humor, you don't know whether you're talking about the truth or not exactly, but you're in a sense doing both, and that's what's so great about humor. It sort of takes things down a notch when it comes to taking the world seriously. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of like a pressure, sort of a depressurization kind of like tool that that society does need. This is why humor is so important. How can we install that on the left?
I don't know, man. I mean, it comes back to Hitler and the Nazis, and what's going on right now is that, I mean, back before the Nazi regime, they tried getting rid of comedians because as soon as you try policing language and thought, there's no room for humor. That's over, because in itself, humor is an exploratory form of intellectualism. Is like you're prying here and there, and you're free to roam around and poke at anyone. But that completely goes against the whole concept in itself.
Yeah, but I mean, what if I was a comedian on the left that actually abided by the rules? So, because see, the more extreme their rules and their identity politics becomes,
ridiculous it would be.
Exactly. Then my humor, if I were to follow every single rule, I think it would become apparent that every single rule is kind of ridiculous, right?
You can make it really self-deprecating because you're white, you're a white male. Like,
yeah.
Really self-deprecating. And
yeah, exactly. I should be a comedian I would be completely so not funny because there's no room to be funny that it would become funny, because it would become funny by the virtue of me trying to respect the sort of new social norm that's being established.
Yeah,
that's where the funniness would lie.
I started going to comedy nights. There's a spot right around the corner from my place, the Art Loft, and it's funny how much that comes up. But the comedians there, they're always like, fuck off, guys. Like, it's a joke. You can take it. It's weird.
Yeah, that's not good. That's not good. Not heading in the right direction on that one. But all right, dude, I kind of want to talk about political correctness just for a bit before we wrap it up. I think there's a sort of new perspective that I've kind of come upon in the last couple of years that I think people don't really know about. And I think they think that it's either that political correctness is needed and it's important, and that the way it's going right now is just dandy, it's right, and they support it, which would be the radical left. Or people are like, this is evil, we shouldn't have political correctness at all, blah, blah, blah. So the issue of political correctness is itself kind of polarized, and I don't agree with that. I think political correctness is necessary, okay? It's actually incredibly necessary. The problem is that we're fucking with it. You know, it's not something that you should inflate at all. It should be something that is kind of like dormant. Do you know what I mean? It's just there. You don't touch it. It's just a matter of fact. And here's what I mean. When you have free speech, right? You have the freedom to say whatever you want. If I want to call you, I don't know, you know, a Nazi Jew, right? It's like a funny way of saying you're an Ashkenazi Jew, but I call you Nazi Jew, right? So I'd be like, yeah, Oliver, I'm a Nazi Jew, because that's what you are, Ashkenazi Jew. So I say that. You don't want me to say that, right? So do you call that political correctness, or do you call that courtesy?
Good question.
Right? So like if you say, James, can you not call me that? Then if I agree to not call you that, that to me is just courtesy, right? Yeah. But because you and I are friends. But now if, let's just say in some world where, I know, Nazi Jew was like a sort of saying, like a, you know, a sort of saying that got popular. And then suddenly people started saying, well, you know, a lot of people aren't reacting to it too well, so maybe we shouldn't say it. So that these multiple acts of courtesy that have occurred between people have sort of amalgamated into this more general sense that we shouldn't say it so much, right? Mm-hmm. That is political correctness to me. It's literally a social contract between multiple people, right? Between a society that comes to an agreement on how to regulate our speech, okay, without making it political. And that's where I think the term itself, political correctness, is kind of misleading. And if we want to change it, or at least, you know, reduce the harm of political correctness, then we're going to have to come up with a new term, I think, that would make more sense, right? Because political correctness really does serve to protect free speech by allowing us to govern how we feel we should speak to each other without making it political and without legislating speech or compelling it, right? So it's like pre-political. It's right there before. It's a small layer. And if you inflate it even just a little bit, then it goes right down the slide, and then it becomes what it has become today, right? So political correctness should never be something that someone says to another person, hey, you're not being politically correct, or hey, that's not politically correct. That should never be said. The term should never be said, right? It should always be a reaction between two people. It should be a person saying something, the other person saying, do you mind not calling me that? And then over time, because we start, people, you know, that kind of ideology or that kind of sense sort of spreads, people just stop using that word, okay? So that to me is political correctness. I don't know what kind of term we could use to supplant it, but that's something we should think about as well.
I mean, is cultural or social correctness?
Yeah, but I feel like whatever term we use, you know, if we use the word correctness, that's the problem. Because if you can say social correctness, but then that'll become the same thing, right? Oh, that's not socially correct. You know, that's the problem with, it's such a slippery thing, right? I mean, political correctness is slippery in that manner. You can be politically correct with the term politically correct, right? You can say, oh, you know, we don't use that term anymore. It's not politically correct because politics are evil and, like, you know, causes a lot of, you know, offense, and people are scared and they don't like the feeling of the word politics because politics is just, you know what I mean? So like, you need to use a term that supplants correctness itself. Right. You know, that's the problem. You know what I mean?
Because it has to be more of like,
it's like political flexibility.
Technical, it's very rigid. We need something a bit more
flexible. Political flexibility. You know, you could call it that. You could say, oh yeah, you know, that's a politically flexible word. People.
That's a politically tense term.
Not even tense. It can't have anything to do with morality, right? Correct has to do with morality.
Tense just has to do that there's a bit of tenseness. There's a
Yeah, but see, if you invoke an emotion or you invoke morality, that's the problem. You're trying to govern a sort of like,
I
state.
don't see how that invokes morality. I think it's less than preferable.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing. It shouldn't have to do with preference. It should have to do with preference de facto, but not linguistically speaking. That's why I think flexibility would be a better term, because it's kind of like, oh, um,
That's
you know,
not politically flexible.
it's exactly because it has nothing to do with an emotion, or it has nothing to do with like anything that could relate to morality. It's simply, oh, this is a word that isn't flexible right now. It's not something that can be used, or it's not something that's really being used
Hmm.
at the moment. It's a matter of fact, not a matter of will, you know?
I don't know. That's not politically flexible. Like if I call someone a faggot and they say that's not
Yeah,
politically flexible.
it's not politically flexible. I mean, you could call someone a faggot. Why not? If I call someone a faggot and they're not gay, for example, or even if so faggot apparently means, a faggot is a stick. This is why the British say, I'll have a fag, it means to smoke.
Originally the word had nothing to do with gay people. They started saying that
No.
it was offensive because it referred to the wood that was used to burn gay people, but that's not true. It referred to a bundle of wood that was a burden. The whole
Yes.
idea is like when you call someone a faggot, it means you're a burden on me.
Yeah,
That's
okay. It could be that, or even if it is because it's tinder, or it's wood that we use to make fires, and we want gay people to burn. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. The fact is, if I call someone a faggot, right? Regardless of if them being gay or not gay, but that's why it's not flexible between the two. If I called you a faggot and you're not gay, at least when the word faggot was still something that was in circulation, it wasn't completely out of the lexicon due to political correctness, then you did get this sensation that you couldn't call a gay person a faggot, but you could call your friends that weren't gay a faggot. You know what I mean? And that's what I'm saying, is that there's a flexibility that changed there when those times were actually that way. I remember specifically that being the case. It was flexible when I used it to my friends, but it wasn't flexible if when it came to gay people, because of some apparent kind of historic cause. But I think the flexibility of words, the reason for why I like flexibility is that because it can always come back. The word is never just like, oh, we don't use it anymore, it's old. It's that the idea, the very freedom of it to come back is a lot more kind of likely. And it doesn't matter about trying to bring it back. All it has to do is that it's a word, it has the ability to come back and take on a new meaning. And that's important, right? We should not abandon the word faggot just because, the Brits aren't going to abandon the word faggot. You know what I mean? And if they do, well, that's to me, it's sad, because that's part of their culture. And in fact, a lot of people take joy in that difference in culture, right? They enjoy, like, oh, that's funny. You know what I mean? You guys call it a faggot and we call it a cigarette or a smoke or whatever.
I mean, it's like going to Australia and telling them that they can't use the word cunt.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be like, what are you, a fucking cunt? You can't tell me that, not to use the word cunt, mate. But, yeah.
No, it's ridiculous. What do you think of PETA now trying to ban sentences like to beat a dead horse, or only so many ways to skin a cat, or kill two birds with one stone? They're trying to replace these sentences.
I know, it's fucking retarded, dude. That's retarded. And that's another thing about political correctness we haven't talked about. The indoctrination has gotten so intense that it's allowed for political correctness to sort of jump outside of its sort of kind of like, parameters, because political correctness is purely linguistic. It has nothing to do with, what we do. And yet, that's what it's done. It's like, you know what I mean? Like someone could like, I don't know, let's say there's a celebrity that goes to sign autographs, right? And then there's a black guy in front of him, but this little girl sort of, is behind him, and so the celebrity will go and give the autograph to the little girl first, right? Someone could say like, oh, that was so politically incorrect. And this doesn't make sense to us because we understand that this is a linguistic sort of term, but people nowadays, especially the younger generation, the the people who are propagating the ideology the most, I believe, they see political correctness as being an action as well, not only a linguistic thing.
No. I mean, I think even as a kid, I heard of like I got the movie Borat. I think I was like 12 for my 12-year-old birthday or something like that. And I remember I think it was my mother who referred to the whole movie or just everything he did as not politically correct. It can be an action. It can be just something that is generally considered offensive or edgy or out there, controversial.
Okay, so that would be a specific example of, for example, he's using an accent that's not his own, so that itself is politically incorrect.
Yeah, and I mean, he does play on a lot of things. Like, he's walking downtown in New York, and he sees a woman. He's like, very, very nice. How much?
Oh yeah, yeah. See that's how is that?
Because it's calling the woman a prostitute.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's not about it's not just about using a word or not using a word. It's about even asking a certain question or not asking a certain question. Right.
It's
So like
socially acceptable. It once again, it's this question of what's moral.
yeah, and this is why I think it's got to be political flexibility. It's because again, that is a perfect example. That's why Sacha Baron Cohen is such a genius, is that he demonstrates that very well. I mean, this guy comes from culture where this is normal. In fiction at least, it's normal in his culture to just ask a girl how much she's worth. So that political flexibility you could equate as being kind of relativist, but you need relativism in this instance, because then otherwise what do you have? Well, you have what's happening today, which is absolute tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
So political flexibility is that for a reason. It's relativist so that we can come to an understanding without legislation, because the moment you legislate, that's the moment it's become tyrannical. And the moment you don't have political flexibility, then you have just a brute kind of savage society, a rude.
I don't know. I agree. I understand what you're saying, but I think it is self-regulating.
So it's self-regulating. It is.
Yeah, you don't have to force it.
So like I said, it only takes a bad handful of people to just kind of inflate this self-regulating sort of mechanism. It's like, oh, cool, let's go out there and just like shame people, every time they do something we don't like. It's very easy to do that. I could sit at work, and then whenever a coworker says something specific, I could be like, excuse me, but I'm part of what you're talking about, and I don't appreciate you, saying that in that way. You know what I mean? Anybody can inflate this mechanism, and those are the people that we don't have to shut the fuck up. We don't need, because that's the point. We don't want people to shut the fuck up. We want them to be ashamed. We want them to be shamed and ridiculed for those things. And in order to do that, we need comedy and we need free speech. We need to be able to say it, and we have to say it. We got to regain the power and restore balance to this sort of out of whack system, and be like, dude, what you're saying doesn't make any fucking sense. You're welcome to say it, but I don't give a fuck, and you're not going to cower me into the corner and make me feel ashamed for this. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, no, that's a big part of this, is being able to stand up for yourself, learning how to separate yourself from the crowd.
Exactly.
That's huge. That's not easy. It's really not easy for a lot of people.
Well, and it becomes more and more difficult, because then it's not about appearing, alone and being alone. It's about losing your fucking job, right? And that's the problem.
Yeah.
So.
And ostracism, social ostracism, has the same reaction in the brain as physical torture. Did you know that? Yeah.
That's interesting.
We're social beings, man.
Yeah.
That's why, like, isolation, not socializing, can reduce your lifespan. I mean, unless you're doing a lot of other shit to balance it out, but.
Yeah, that's speaking of socialization, I think that's a good segue into not socializing any longer. I think it's getting pretty late.
Yeah, but, I don't know if I've actually been here that much this whole conversation. I barely slept last night. I'm exhausted.
Yeah, I'm getting there too, buddy. But I think it was a good start anyway. I hope people really kind of have a few ideas, after listening to this.
Yeah. It's I think we went a little bit all over the place, but
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'll see you later, bro.
yeah, man. Night.
Peace.